Hi, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing to you the second half of my conversation with Mark Cousins, the film critic and historian. We spoke on September 6, 2016. If you'd like to read a full transcript of this conversation, please check the link in the description below, and also below you'll see a link to my Patreon where your support helps me continue the work on this project. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's trying to figure itself out, because part of it's compounded by the fact that as a medium, which is a very broad thing to talk about anyway, but people they age out or they lose interest because of a variety of reasons. But part of it is, likely the thing that you were remembering about video games back in the day is still a very pronounced note today. Mm-hmm. So it tends to lose people. People tend not to have, I think, according to my interviews at least, the typical length of a career in the game industry is about 8 years. Mm-hmm. So every attempt to sort of push things forward, there needs to be a sort of, resetting, calibrating among whatever the next crop of people is from year to year. So it's interesting what you say, because I think of a thing I'm sure you probably have not heard of. Maybe you've heard of the game Halo, but when they were talking about making Halo, the people behind it were talking about trying to perfect the quote-unquote perfect 30-second loop of fun. And then there was a game that came out a couple of years ago called Titanfall, where I wrote an essay about it that's similar to the thing you said about how tiring the big cinema is, yes. Where I said, is this too fun? Is that a ridiculous thing to say? So when you have a medium that isn't as assimilated in quite the same way as maybe movies are, careers don't last that long, audience burns out and moves on, how can a medium sort of learn those types of things and self-correct, especially when it's compounded by the fact that, like you said, there's sort of that turbulence going on? Mm-hmm. You don't have to answer that question with a list or a how-to, but this is sort of the bigger thing I'm investigating.
Well, that's exactly, the game industry's, in terms of the histories of art form, right, it's just in its infancy, and I would say that...
Yes. So if you're being generous, it's maybe about 60, 70 years old.
Yeah, and so that's young, that's incredibly young in art form terms, and the simple answer is that, all art forms take time to mature, and for the longest time, it took cinema a long time before people got bored with its... what the film theorists call the cinema of attractions, that idea that it's the film is trying constantly to seduce you, attract you, distract you. And at some point you want to say, look, I'm a grown-up here. Yes, I want sensation, but I want contemplation too. And so the answer to your question is, yeah, there is. If fun is speed, distraction, sensation, then yeah, you can't party all the time. You're going to have to come down, and you're going to have to, you have to stop. And any mature art form, whether it's cinema or games, any maturing art form has to encompass this idea of the contemplative as well as the sensational. And I just believe that that'll come, because there are loads of creative people in the video game world, and I know there are already some more artistic or experimental games that are about that, but there will be, if they want a mature audience, if they want an audience that they can hold on to through decades, then the creative people in the games world will have to reflect how people's sense of speed and kinesis and growing sense of things like landscape and nature develop as they grow up. A child often isn't very interested in a landscape, but as you grow up, you start to appreciate its beauty more, and you just have to incorporate. The creatives need to incorporate those kind of maturer themes into the games worlds, I would say.
So this is also very broad. I guess I should just probably tell you a lot of my questions are going to be very broad and sometimes abstract. But, the other thesis here is, we're talking about the growing pains of that come from a medium that is changing, and there are changing ways to make it and talk about it. So, in film, could you just talk a little bit about how, maybe tech, labor, and communication between audience and creator shaped the course of film history?
No.
I did preface that.
So how do I answer that?
I don't know.
it first of all, it influenced the course of film history in some countries more than other countries. Substantially in the US, lots of countries don't do any testing at all. They won't show rough cuts to audiences to see what are the spikes of fun, what are the bits of the audience likes and what the bit of the audience doesn't like. But that kind of feedback loop was, as you know, pioneered in the US and was central to the filmmaking process in the US. The film wasn't finished until the audience had scored it, as it were. And a little footnote there, which I think I put in the story of film, but it shows the cultural difference between countries. The very happy ending that the American audiences in general liked, were exactly the thing that put off Russian audiences. And so,
yes, that is in there.
Hollywood would often reshoot a film with that unhappy ending. It always makes me laugh. Let's make an unhappy ending so the Russians will like it.
Schadenfreude, I suppose, in some ways.
That's yeah, and also it's a very interesting thing going back to that Jewishness thing. The really great Jewish writers and in music and as well, often would add a squeeze of lemon or a spike of melancholy in there, which of course to my taste enriched the work, but to a lot of people didn't, and so that was. But anyway, so that's off the subject. The question of technology, how did that influence the development of cinema over the history of the medium? Well, I would have to mention the word competition here. It was the fact that new media came along, like TV in particular, which forced American cinema in particular to come up with technological change. They wanted to. Here's the way I would put it. They wanted to use technology to increase the sublime element of movie going. In other words, it had to be wider, and it needed to be louder sound-wise. It needed to be deeper, i.e. 3D. It needed to be more immersive, i.e. 5.1 Dolby stereo mixing. It needs surround sound. That sense of the sublime was something that, even though Hollywood wouldn't use a fancy word like that, that's what it was after. And also what those filmmakers, what those creatives were really interested in was our nervous systems. They wanted to jangle, they wanted to play with, they wanted to seduce our nervous systems, hence the loudness, hence the brightness, hence the sensation of depth. And Alfred Hitchcock famously said he would love to not make the film at all, just dispense with the film and sit people in a seat and plug them into some kind of device that could stimulate their sense of fear or laughter or suspense or terror directly. It sounds slightly like a mad doctor experiment, but I think that technology was sort of the middle person in this relationship, where the creatives wanted to do something to people to give them physical, bodily, and emotional sensations, and they used technology to do so.
Well, there's similarly, talking about jangling of central nervous systems, there's another coincidental parallel in that in the story of film you talk about film studios being purchased by Coca-Cola.
Yes.
Something that has been commented to me by people I've interviewed is that it's very strange to them how people can come and work in the game industry from all over. And a lot of people who work in marketing at the big budget game companies come from places like Coca-Cola, where the focus is on reinventing and marketing the same products in different ways rather than adapting or making new products.
Yes.
I'm sure you remember New Coke and how that turned out.
Yes.
How does that mentality from places like a Coca-Cola coming to a movie studio, how does that? That's another broad one, but how does this sort of impact the creative output or treatment of employees or executives?
Well, at the broadest level, it's not a surprise, because what Coke is selling a dream and a myth, rather than it's obviously selling a fizzy drink as well. And when I climbed about the other day, I was desperate for a Coke, but it's selling that kind of image of yourself as a kind of outdoorsy, fun-loving, physically active person who's got loads of friends, and those images from the Coke adverts, etc. And cinema selling a similar kind of mythic sense of self. I want to identify with this world. I want to, plunge into this world. I want to step over the threshold from my world into the Hollywood world or the Coca-Cola world. So it's no surprise at all that particularly people in marketing areas can transfer between these different industries. I don't think it's a surprise at all. Your question was about was it about employment rights? Did you also ask about that?
What's sort of, executives and sort of, because I think sort of the lazy assumption would be that someone who comes from Coca-Cola wants to run a movie studio like it's Coca-Cola.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's true or if you have insight into that.
I don't know how much that I could say of that, that would be of any interest at all. Let me think if I can say anything interesting about that. I would say yes. It has to be said that when the studios when they were sold, the Hollywood studios, again talking about Hollywood, when they were sold and no longer run by the founders or the families of the founders, the cinema became more standardized and less creative. Unfortunately, that's the case. But again, because to make the point about the difference between production and distribution in the studios, it was the distribution in particular that was standardized and suffered, you could say. People working in distribution suffered most at the kind of iron fist tactics of the sort of neo-capitalists who took over in the 80s, in terms of production. So I suppose that's like the machine, but the ghost in the machine, the creativity, the filmmaking itself had to stay flexible or had to stay vibrant, otherwise it would have died. And so I think that the kind of creative element within cinema, the impulse to innovate, is resistant to any attempt to standardize it by people who are coming from other industries, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I don't know that I necessarily have a question in here, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about somewhere where there is maybe not a parallel, more of a fork in the road. Mm-hmm. An interesting difference is, I think, indie films are generally associated with things like Cannes or as being intensely personal works of art.
Yeah.
This is not really the case in games. It's sort of more like the majority of the scene in video games is still trying to ape sort of the equivalent of Hollywood blockbusters or games that did really well 10 or 15 years ago. In instances where indie games do sort of break through, they immediately get sort of commodified by the industry, or it becomes a genre of its own. Minecraft is a very good example of that. Maybe I don't know, do you have like a thought or a reaction to that, or is there anything
I do,
from...
because did you ever read that great piece? I think it was in the New York Times that Walter Murch wrote this piece about cinema moving from being a fresco art to an oil painting art. Did you ever come across that?
No, I didn't.
It's a great piece. It's a great metaphor he uses. He says, look, for so long the technology was so big and expensive that cinema was basically like fresco painting. You needed a big team of people and you were covering big patches, and so you told big stories, history stories. And so until the 1960s, that's sort of what cinema was, with a few European exceptions where there are arty people making little personal films. But overall, it was a big art form, lots of people, big stories, and you needed the equivalent of the Vatican, which was Hollywood, to back you. And then he said what happened, the technology changed massively, and therefore the art changed, and it became instead about individual artists painting in oil paints, i.e. small digital cameras or small 16mm cameras. And he saw this as a fundamental shift or cleave in the way cinema worked, and I think that's true. And I would guess that the same could happen would happen in video game, because it's too interesting and too creative. It's got too much creative potential, the video game world, to be controlled by or to be only manifest in big, highly marketed things, it will have its oil painters as well, and increasingly so, I would have thought. As it diversifies, every art form branches out. I can't think of any art form that has narrowed down over its lifetime. So video games will surely as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think about maybe you can talk a little bit about just sort of the instances where the relationship in the movie industry is a little strange, maybe, where, when you talk about the divide, well, not even the divide, but just from the camp and the independent filmmakers and the camp that's in the industry. I mean, there are many instances where I think it's sort of things are made to look more independent than they maybe really are. I don't know if Blair, the first Blair Witch Project movie, is a good example of that. I mean, does anything sort of come to mind that along those lines, as far as just strange or interesting or maybe dishonest ways the film industry has tried to make things seem more independent, and why that might be?
Yeah, there are loads of examples of that, mostly in US cinema, I have to say, and I'll mention why in a minute. But in US cinema, there are lots of, unintentionally muffled sound recording. And, I've been on loads of shoots where there are 6 tripods sitting unused, and they're hand holding and sweating under the lights to try and make it look cheaper, as it were, because that's an aesthetic, and that comes from lifestyle stuff, and that's kind of social change, and that you can see that in music as well, and the way that people want to have a kind of whole lo-fi aesthetic. So that isn't only a film thing, that's a culture thing, and a reaction against the commodification of art and culture in general, but it's particularly noticeable in the US since the 1990s. Because the US has no state-funded public sector film industry, so to speak, then what you have is what you rightly say is a mainstream, and then various type of independent filmmaking. We don't use those terms as much, of course, out with the US, partly because we're all dependent, but secondly, the main split is between public sector and private sector filmmaking, and so that doesn't quite map onto the split in America between Hollywood and indie cinema. And so here we have, and when I say here, in the UK, but in also most European countries now, as you know, there's a sense that cinema is part of culture and part of linguistic history, etc., and therefore it's funded by the government. And so in that system, in public sector funded film, you don't have anything like that pretending. If anything, you're trying to make your film look more expensive than it really is. And so that kind of slightly perverse worshipping of the lo-fi is more a US phenomenon, I think.
Well, I have just a couple more questions for you here, but how much of film being sort of considered unquestionably cultured do you feel comes from archival efforts, or just having the ability to, preserve film?
Sorry, say that again.
How much of film being considered sort of unquestionably cultured do you feel comes from the ability to, archive or preserve it?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think the answer is quite a lot. Until it was possible really to do retrospectives, to look backwards and say, where did this come from? Where did this visual idea come from? Where did this filmmaker's work come from? Where did this actor's career come from? To see the lineage, it was very hard to argue for cinema as an art or of cultural value. And so once it was possible to preserve film and to store it and restore it, etc., that was very important. But also, of course, the archives of any country. I'm involved with the archives of India and of Albania, strangely, and in both of them, they go to politicians and say, look, this is our heritage. If you want your citizens to see what we were like 100 years ago, you have to pay for the restoration and the maintenance of our cinematic culture, our films. And exactly the same thing, of course, has to be the case with video games. I don't know if people are talking about archiving video games, and I'm sure hopefully it's all being done, but when you laugh, I guess it's not being done then. But
well, part of why, you know, I'm doing this project. It's sort of a sticky or conflicted, or there's not like uniform messaging. I interviewed the Library of Congress last year, and their guy who is in charge of their moving picture library told me that based on the way he was treated by the game industry, he feels that they don't even feel that what their output is or has been in the past is culture. They just kind of get rid of stuff when they're done with projects, or they look at it only in terms of things to market or to sell.
That's exactly the same as what happened in cinema. And still, in some countries like India, that's exactly the case. It's very hard to say to Indian people, your old movies from the 40s are of any value. They were just junked. You know, they were melted down to get the silver out of the silver halide in the celluloid. So it's extremely similar. It took cinema a long time to realize what a tragic loss it was overseeing. And so please, if the games industry can learn one thing from the film industry, it's that. You know, this stuff might not seem valuable now, especially if it didn't make money, you know, but that's no reason not to store it and archive it and have it accessible for the future.
Well, so something else I did want to ask you about was we didn't talk too much about like fan culture or fandom in video games. I'm going to guess that maybe that's not too much on your radar. So the inverse is you know, what maybe sort of confounds you about the way film fans interact and talk online or off?
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating. They are in a tiny little loop.
We have a lot in common. You know that?
It feels as if film fans online are talking about they don't want the world to change. There's incredible fuel of nostalgia where they want a sort of slight variation on the same thing, or they want to talk about, if they're older, they want to talk about The Godfather all the time. If they're younger, they want to talk about Tarantino all the time, and if they're younger still, they want to talk about whatever else. You know, and that sense of fan culture is very based on formative experiences you have when you were a teenager, which somehow opened your eyes to the world and branded themselves in your brain. And lots of people just want to revisit those pleasures again and again and again. And it does excuse my swearing, fucking nut in. Because I just can't. I'm completely the opposite. You know, if I never hear a Beatles song again, I'll be happy. The Beatles predated me, but I do not ever need to see Citizen Kane again. I never need to see. You know, I want new stuff, and you have to enrich the media, your art form, by making new stuff. And fan culture has got a kind of arrested development about it, a kind of onanism about it, a kind of, you know, you could push that metaphor further, but I'm not going to. But there's a sense of, let's say, self-gratification about it, which is very troubling.
Is this, I mean, I talked to a lot of people for this project, as I said, and a lot of people feel that the internet acted as a kind of catalyst for this type of behavior or worse. I mean, I don't know if I don't know if you have a feeling one way or the other.
So.
I don't think so either. The question I'd ask instead is, I mean, sort of the nature of fame. I'm curious to hear you talk about how you feel the internet maybe changed that.
People are very keen to say that the internet has caused everything, or caused anything that seems new, the internet caused it. First of all, what seems new probably isn't new, and secondly, there's a good chance the internet didn't cause it. You know, I remember my father, who was a Elvis Presley obsessive, and he just wanted to listen to the same, you know, records all the time. You know, just a few, you know, Jailhouse Rock and Blue Suede Shoes, and that's exactly the same. You know, I think that human beings are hardwired, and have been now for tens of thousands of years, to once you get a pleasure hit, it's a Pavlovian thing. Once you've had a pleasure hit, especially when you're young, you want to revisit that pleasure again and again. So I don't think the internet has caused that at all. I think, however, in the nature of celebrity and celebrity structure, and how certainly the internet has ushered new actors onto Planet Fame, you know, and so the Planet Fame is much easier to get to now than it ever has been, and it's more populated than it has been in a long time in the Western world. Different in Asia, I have to say. So the internet has caused new types of famous people for new types of reason, but in no way, I think, has it yet changed the psychology of the pleasures of fame or why we're attracted to or fascinated by famous people. It's the same old stuff, which is self-loss, our erotic imaginations, the sense of a kind of mythic self. All these things are, I was going to say timeless, but they're certainly thousands of years old, and they're absolutely, I think it's narcissistic of us to think that our age, the digital age, invented a lot of this stuff or has even tweaked it very much. I don't think so.
It's funny you mentioned Planet Fame, because something else I always try to ask people I interview who are outside America is that sort of toxic fan culture, if that feels like an inherently Western or American thing. Some people I've talk about, like, when they go online, it's almost like they're visiting Planet America. They have to speak American when they go online. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do, but I don't agree with that, actually. I think that, I've done loads of things. I've run loads of things with very famous people, and the most intense fame reaction I've ever seen was with Maggie Cheung, the great Hong Kong actor, one of the most famous women in the world, here in Scotland. And I just thought we had crush barriers, etc. And with Chinese and particularly Indian movie stars, and stars in general, pop stars and fashion stars, there's a different intensity of fame. I've seen young women run at their idol and just not put on the brakes, just hope to collide with them, because that collision will be enough. So I think, if anything, it's more intense in Shanghai and Beijing, Mumbai and Calcutta than it is in Los Angeles or somewhere like that. But it's different there because in India, for example, fame is much more to do with families. If there's one famous person in the family, then the daughter and son will all be famous. You don't quite get that so much in more individualistic America, and I think that's a good thing. And people have to at least have some attribute in order to get famous, even if Kim Kardashian's. I won't complete that sentence, but you know where I was going with that. But in very family-based societies, you simply have to be the son or daughter of someone, and you become famous in their own right. So the cultures are subtly different in the different continents, but I would say that fame in Asia is even more of a hothouse than it is in the Western world.
Well, I have just one more question for you here, and many of the questions have been big and broad. And normally I ask people this about video games, but since that's not your wheelhouse,
okay.
What do you feel film has accomplished?
Film has accomplished. Okay, film has added to the visual lexicon of the world. You and I are using words now, and we've got our camera phones switched off, so we're not looking at each other, so we're using a verbal lexicon. But film has massively increased the visual language in the world. I think that's the first thing I would say. That's a sort of art answer. The second is a kind of social or society answer. I think that cinema, lots of us use this word, an empathy machine. Cinema has been good over the years at showing us lots of things, at showing us other places, other cultures. It's not brilliant at all stuff. It's not great at showing war, for example, but it has opened our eyes to other societies and other ways of living, and I think that's a major achievement. The great French filmmaker Robert Bresson says this thing that I think is the perfect advice to any artist. He says, try to show that which without you might never have been seen. And I think cinema has showed us things without it we wouldn't have seen.